Hi, welcome back to the Agent Insider. I'm your host, Andy Jewell. Thanks for joining me today. Today, I wanted to go over some things on condominium insurance. So, really want to approach this more from the unit owner's perspective. So, a lot of times people don't understand what they're needing. I get people that call in, they're like, hey, I'm buying a condo, we need insurance. And I'll start to ask them some questions about what kind of insurance they're going to need to have to go with that. And oftentimes they have no idea, even though they're buying a condo, they don't really understand what it is that they're buying. So I just wanted to touch base on some basics, probably bad grammar, touch base on basics, but on what you should be thinking about if you're buying a condo unit. So the main building, the structure is going to be owned in common, which is why it's a condominium, because you're basically owning a percentage of the total building is divided up into the percentage of based on the number of units that are in the association. You don't own the exterior or the common elements. You own a percentage of them. So you don't own the roof right over your unit. Typically, you would own a percentage of the total roof. Their master policy that's in place, because each association is going to need to have its own master policy that's ensuring the association as a whole, is going to work a couple of different ways. And I'm going to speak just in general terms. There might be some variances by states that you're in. And so you would want to make sure to understand that with condo law for the state that you're residing in or that you're buying that condo in. So in general, if you're buying the unit, the exterior is going to be covered by the association. The interior could be covered by the association, or it could be covered by you. So in like real layman's terms, we could call it studs in and studs out for kind of a visual of what that might look like. So a studs in policy on the master policy, if it's an interior coverage as well, the association policy not only covers the exterior walls, windows, roof, siding, but it would also include all of the interior drywall, floor coverings, basic cabinets. So they're going to cover basically a move-in ready unit. Now, inside of that policy, you might still need to carry some building coverage on your own unit owner's policy, because if there's been upgrades, that would not be normally covered on the master policy. So you would still need to have some building coverage of your own just to cover upgrades. The other way that the master policy could work would be if they're only covering the shell. So it studs out, kind of an idea. So the drywall in could be your responsibility as the unit owner. So you would have to have more building coverage on your unit owner policy, because if there's a major fire, the master policy is just rebuilding the shell of the building, and you're walking into where you're going to see drywall. You're not going to see drywall. You're going to see studs, just the wood 2x4 studs. And then you're going to need to finish it with the drywall, paint, flooring, cabinets, countertops, the whole 9 yards. So obviously you need a lot more coverage on that particular type of policy. So it's really important to ask for the CC&Rs or the covenants and the bylaws of the association while you're going through that sales process, because inside of that, inside of the covenants and bylaws, it's going to specify how the master policy needs to work. So that way you can make sure that you're buying the right policy, because you could be buying too much coverage that you don't need to have, or you could be buying too little, and then you don't find that out until the time of a claim. So it's definitely a good idea to get that information as part of your due diligence as you're purchasing a condo unit. Some other things that I always tell people to think about inside of that, even if you have that where the condo master policy is covering the interior, and so you're like, I'm just worried about upgrades. Sometimes and I'm seeing this more and more now as the market for condominium policies is becoming harder, especially on older buildings. So buildings built prior to 1990, which doesn't really feel like it's older because I'm built prior to 1990. And I'm like, that's not that long ago. But in general, insurance carriers are looking at buildings built prior to 1990 and they're rating them harder. They're increasing rates. So oftentimes what we're seeing is that the associations are going with much higher deductibles to help offset some of those rates. And so now all of a sudden, instead of, a $5,000 deductible, they might have a $25,000 deductible, and or some of them will even go higher and they'll go to a percentage deductible. And then what happens if only one unit is damaged? It's just your unit that gets damaged in a fire or smoke damage. And they go, well, that's below the deductible of the master policy. And so you would then need to make sure you had enough coverage on your policy to cover the interior damage, because they would just assess that out to you because it was only your unit that was damaged. In thinking about assessments too, the other thing that becomes up and becomes a bigger issue is loss assessment. So loss assessment means if there's something that could have been covered on an insurance policy, standard insurance policy, and it was not covered either because of a deductible or because they chose not to carry that coverage, then they can assess that loss out to the unit owners. There's coverage on a unit owner's policy that would pick that up, and that's called loss assessment. So you can buy up that coverage amount. Usually most policies will come with a standard of $1,000 or $5,000 of loss assessment, which isn't a lot, and it's not very expensive typically to increase that coverage. So I definitely recommend increasing that coverage. Some people will tell me like, hey, I got the master policy, and so I'm not worried about having my own unit owner's policy. They're covering the interior of the walls. If there's a loss assessment, I'll eat it, which is fine. But a couple of things to think about if that's your approach to saying, I don't want to buy a unit owner's policy, would be your contents still are not covered on a master policy. So that's something that you would still want to make sure that you have coverage for. Liability for you personally is not covered on a master policy. They're covering the liability of the association, but they're not covering your liability. So you would want to make sure that you still have a policy in place to cover your personal liability. The other thing to make sure that you're thinking about when it comes to your own unit owner's policy would be loss of use. So if there's a fire or some sort of a claim that puts you out of your home because it has to be repaired or rebuilt, you want to make sure that you have coverage to pay for you staying someplace else, because typically you still have a mortgage that you have to pay. And now you're also going to have to pay additional living expenses that would be covered on your own unit owner's policy. So some things to think about. The biggest thing I would say, just to kind of circle all the way back around to where I was, is that you should get a copy of your CC&Rs and the bylaws to make sure that you know what your responsibility is, what is common area, what is the association going to cover, and how do you need to make sure to structure your own policy to pick up any gaps, but don't overpay on your individual policy and have coverages you don't need just because you didn't understand or because your agent didn't know what they needed to give you. They just give you everything, and then you end up paying hundreds of dollars a year more than you need to, just trying to make sure that you're covered properly. A couple other things I just want to touch on real quick for condominiums. This really could be on homeowners in general, is the usage. So oftentimes people, I just think it's more common in condominiums, but it can happen in any types of residential properties. People will buy them. It's a second home, and then they decide they want to start making some additional money. So they start looking to rent it out on Vrbo or Airbnb or a similar site. If your insurance is not set up properly, you could have a gap of coverage. So even if they say, hey, you can, like Airbnb and VRBO, they have coverage that they say that will apply while it's being rented out. So that you think, well, no big deal. I don't need to talk to my insurance agent about it. And you just go for it. The issue that you can run into, though, is there are going to be some small gaps of the time between when you accept, the time before they check in, but it's on that day that they're going to check in, or the day that they check out after they check out, but before you get back. And there's some business use that's associated with that, which could put limitations and exclusions on your basic underlying policy or your basic homeowner's policy or your basic unit owner's policy. And so you would want to make sure that you have the proper coverage in place so there's no gaps either for liability or for fire. The other thing that I often see is that a lot of those like home share websites will say, hey, we'll cover if they cause damage. But if there's something that happens while they're renting it, but it was not the fault of the tenants, then they're not going to cover it. VRBO would not cover it. They'd say, hey, that was your own fault that there was a short in your wiring that caused a fire. That wasn't the fault of the tenant, so we don't cover it. But then the homeowner's policy looks at it and says, well, you were using it as a rental, even though it didn't contribute to the loss because that's an excluded use of the property, or it could be depending on your policy, then they can still deny coverage, even though that's not what caused the loss to begin with. So it's important just to make sure that your policy is put together in a way that you're not going to be left exposed. Typically, there's not a huge price difference between those things, and it's well worth the peace of mind to just know you don't have to worry about it. I tell people that a lot, as like the reason you're buying insurance is you're transferring risk from yourself to the insurance company. So really what you want to make sure you're thinking about every time you're making an insurance decision is, how much risk do I want to transfer? And how much risk am I okay to take myself? You're not going to transfer every risk available from yourself to the insurance company because it becomes too expensive and it's not a reasonable way to do business or a reasonable way to live your life. There's inherently just some risk that's involved, but you want to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to a risk that you didn't intend to expose yourself to. So it's important just to make sure as things change, usage of property, usage of your cars, anything that's changing in your life that changes the basics of what you're doing, it's worth sending an email or having a quick conversation with your agent just to make sure you're not exposing yourself in a way you didn't intend to. Now, if you're okay with the risk and you exposed yourself, then that's fine. You're self-insuring it, and that's fine to do so. Just make sure that you're not accidentally self-insuring yourself for something you didn't intend to do so. Well, I think that's been a long-winded rant on condominium insurance. I'm hope that it helps somebody out there. If you guys have questions, feel free to send me an email. You can email me at theagentinsider@gmail.com. So that email address again is theagentinsider@gmail.com. And shoot me any questions, or if there's a topic about insurance that you want to hear more about, let me know. I'd be happy to put that on our docket to address. Until next time, guys, thanks so much and have a great day.